Hi, I'm Dr. Micah Sellers, and welcome to Forces of Change, where we decode disruption at the intersection of technology, policy, and purpose.
And I'm Annie Graziani. I'm co-host of Forces of Change. And today we're inviting Jason Bryant. He's the executive director of CROP Organization. He leads transformative work that reimagines the justice system through proximity leadership and community-based alternatives to incarceration. His approach centers a fundamental insight. Those who've lived through the system's failures are the experts best positioned to design effective solutions. So Jason, welcome.
Thank you.
Well, Jason, let's get started. So you spent 20 years incarcerated. Most people would see that as lost time, but you earned 2 master's degrees, became a certified counselor, and co-founded an organization that's now transforming Reentry in California. How did you turn incarceration into a classroom for change?
I appreciate the question. I was raised in a loving 2-parent household where my father was Black, my mom's Italian, and at a young age, I was exposed to racism. And the first time I actually encountered it was in the home, in an argument between my parents, and the way my dad reacted to it informed me of something. I used that experience as how I was to respond if someone was to ever demean me or make me seem like I was less than. It wasn't long after that I started making those early decisions about how the world was, the paradigms that I shaped for myself, that I began to go to school. In 2nd grade was the first time where I was ever called a defamatory, racist slur. And my reaction was pretty immediate. Let's fight. Let's go meet in the parking lot and fight in 2nd grade. And from that, I just continued to build upon this negative paradigm about what it meant to be a man, especially a man of color. I identified with the kids who I thought were tough, who were cool, and I was attracted to that because I thought that's what it meant to be a man. By the time I was 15 years old, we moved to Northern California. So I went from Southern California, predominantly white schools, to Northern California, same thing. And I met a friend who was 2 years older than me to the day. And he was the toughest kid in the school. All the girls wanted to be with him. All the guys wanted to be him. And we had a very unhealthy relationship that we thought was friendship, where we were loyal to each other to a fault. A lot of the stereotypical or typical things that young men do: drinking, partying, objectifying ourselves, objectifying others. And in December of 1999, I was 20 years old, and my co-defendant's name is Ted, was 22. We committed a crime that resulted in a man being murdered in his own home. I was sentenced to 26 years to life, and he was sentenced to 40 years to life as one of the people who actually shot our victim. I was sentenced to 26 years to life because I was there. In California, they had a law at the time called the felony of murder rule that said if you're in commission of a felony and someone dies, you're guilty of murder. So this was my first offense. I was already kind of a dipstick, but I just had never gotten caught in my teenage years. Certainly nothing to this severity, but it was I was building up to this type of damage. On the day of my arrest, I was actually arrested at my parents' home. And like I said, I was raised in a loving household. It wasn't there wasn't trauma throughout. There was the early experiences that kind of formed the way I was starting to think about things. But my dad, he was significantly older. He was 46 when I was born. So he was in his 60s when I committed my life crime. And I remember on my day of arrest, the sheriffs had, came in and put me in handcuffs, and they were walking me down the driveway of my parents' home. And at the end of the driveway was my dad, who was crying uncontrollably. And now this is the first time in my life I'd ever seen my dad cry. He was like one of those salt of the earth, work from dark to dark kind of guys. But he was broken seeing his son in chains and being hauled off to account for crimes that he committed. So that was my earliest transformational moment. It was a very simple realization that the choices I was making were impacting the people who I love the most. So like that's a long answer for like one part of your question, Annie, as to like how I turned it into a place of education, change, transformation. It started with my recognition that my choices were impacting the people who I love the most. And then there were other realizations along the way, but I could probably go on for the entire hour talking about those.
When did you conceive of the program?
Of the program that I currently
Yeah.
okay. All right. So as far as currently I'm the executive director of the crop organization. We have a signature program called Ready for Life.
Uh-huh.
And just a little bit of context or backstory behind that. My first 10 years of incarceration was largely spent in isolation, where I was working on my own like development, my own education, doing my best to stay out of the way. My last 10 years was contrasted by a reunification with my co-defendant, who I was speaking about a moment ago, who had founded the crop organization with his dad to help disrupt the anti-social race-based culture inside of prison. So crop was initially founded to like introduced music equipment, sporting equipment, because Ted, my co-defendant, he knew that it's hard to hate somebody who you're in a band with or, who you're on a baseball team with. But when we reconnected 10 years into our sentence, there was a new opportunity to add value and further the work of transforming the culture inside of prison. He presented an opportunity for us to work together. I initially resisted, given our historical context, and he offered me an old African proverb that you can either go fast alone or you can go far together. And, I took that as a signal to kind of reflect on the situation so far. I had spent 10 years inside. I was close to a bachelor's degree at the time, but I hadn't done very much to contribute to other people's success. I was living in a community of people who had similar dreams of freedom, reunification with their family, and I had done very little to support that. So I made a new decision, and Ted and I began to work together and identify other incarcerated leaders who are not only working on their own rehabilitation, but also like willing to contribute to something bigger than themselves. So like the work started with identifying people who were proximate, who were living inside and who wanted to create something new inside of prison. We went on for the next 10 years building programs on like alcohol and other drug certification, personal leadership development, scholarships for the youth, things of those nature. And then in 2020, Governor Newsom ordered both mine and Ted's immediate release. So there's the context behind like how we got to me being the ED today. We got out in 2020, and it was COVID. You couldn't leave your house, much less go into a prison. But we knew that we had more that we could do. So we looked at like what was available outside of prison, and we noticed that there's a lot of gaps in the reentry space. So the four of us sat around a table, which grew to five. Another individual by the name of Ken, who we had done time with and had recognized like some of the gaps in the reentry system. We sat around the table. We had about 100 years of lived experience between the five of us, and we said, what would a program look like for us from our perspective that would really support people in a holistic way coming home from incarceration? We thought about the mindset work that was needed, the space for people to unpack the trauma of prison and their past, and cultivate not just a leadership mindset, but a mindset that was rooted in establishing a vision for a future worth having. We knew that we needed to provide them with digital skills, financial wellness, understanding. Like these are things that people just don't interact with inside of prison. We knew that we needed to provide them with training in careers that offered family sustaining wages, because the number one driver for incarceration is poverty. We knew we needed to talk to employers, because you can have somebody with the right mindset and the right skill set, but if an employer won't hire, it's all for naught, right? And the last thing was we knew that it's hard to get anything done if you don't have a roof over your head. So we knew we needed to have a housing component. So that was the genesis of the program. Like it was five guys sitting around a table in Folsom, California, saying, what would it look like from our perspective?
So I'd like to pull on a thread. Yeah, as we're, the name of our program is Forces of Change. Yeah,
Mm,
I'd love to get your perspective, right, on what are some of the forces at play, right, that are kind of holding us as a society back from changing from a punishment-based system to a rehabilitation-based system. Yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with the Norwegian model.
mm,
There's a lot of great research, coming out on how efficacious that system really is.
mm.
We certainly don't have that system in place here in the United States at the state or federal level. I'd love to get your perspective on what are some of the societal problems that maybe
Yeah,
having headwinds against that, or some of the policy issues that may be creating headwinds against that kind of change.
sure. I'd love to answer that question. I think it might be good to start with like how I was first introduced to the difference in the way in which we do prison here and the way we do it in, like, say, Norway, right? So when I was inside, there was an individual who visited our like incarcerated leadership team who was like interested in giving back, like wanted to see what was wrong with prison. But before he did, he took a trip to 2 other countries. First, he went to an African country, and I don't remember the actual country within Africa, but he went to the prison officials and he said, how do you view your prisoners? And the officials said, in our native language, we don't even have the word prisoner. These are our brothers. These are our sisters. And they've forgotten who they are. And our job is to, keep the community safe, but remind them who they are so they can go home where they belong, because our brothers and sisters don't belong in cages. And he thought that was interesting. So he went to Germany, which, follows a version of the Norwegian model. And he was like in awe by the amount of rehabilitative programs, the way in which people are living. They're like mini studios. And he was able to spend some time with some administrators there. And he said, this is amazing what you're doing here. How in the world are you justifying the spending for this? And what the official said was, these are German citizens. And while it's true that they've committed crimes that they need to be held accountable for, it's also true that they're German citizens. And we as Germans believe that we have created a context in our society that made those decisions they made seem like they were good ones. So our job is to rehabilitate, educate, and restore them, because our German citizens don't belong in cages. Now, there's parallels. I mean, obviously, you're talking about an African country, predominantly Black people, a German country, predominantly white people, what have you. But here in the United States, where we have this melting pot, people can draw whatever conclusion they want. At the end of the day, in California alone, I can tell you right now, in the penal code, there's over 600 references that the purpose of prison is to punish people, not to rehabilitate, not to restore. So, yeah, there's where we start. We start by saying that, look, people who are incarcerated aren't different from us. They're our community members. The skin color may be different. The economic status may be different, but we are all like Americans. We're part of this nation, and we have all contributed to a context of poverty, of marginalization, of lack of opportunity that contributed to them making a decision that resulted in these crimes. Now, should they be held accountable for the crimes? Of course. But what is the purpose of holding them accountable? Is it to punish them, or is it to restore them so they can come back and be responsible, contributing members of our society?
I have a question here, Jason. So I want to go back to when you and when your sentences were commuted by Governor Newsom, back in 2020. And, just a year later, you sat down with Governor Newsom and you pitched him on this concept of Ready for Life and the funding that you ended up receiving that, became what you're doing now. And I think that's just like incredible, right? Such an extraordinary arc from developing this model on the inside, and then being able to bring it out into practice, but then also working with the same governor who commuted you, then funding you. What did you say in that room? How did that happen?
Well, it was on Zoom because it was COVID, and we actually were scheduled to have a 15-minute call with Governor Newsom, really to like thank him for his mercy. It's not every day that a governor orders the immediate release of 2 people who were convicted of murder. But we also wanted to share like what that belief in us was yielding. So what was a 15-minute call turned into an hour-long call with the governor, and we kind of laid out like what the vision was, this 4-pillar program that supported people with their mindset, their skill set, their employment opportunities, and their housing. And by the end of that conversation, he said, that is smart money. Every year, California taxpayers are paying around $130,000 to keep one person in a cage, with less than 2% of that money actually going towards their rehabilitation, and nearly 90% of those people coming home. Like, why would we not make an investment in people succeeding out here so they could be contributing members to society and help the economy versus hurt it, right? So he also was pretty clear. He said, I'm the governor. I can't just like say, here's money for you. If you can go to the legislature and convince them of the value of this, I'd sign it. So we went to work throughout the spring and early summer of 2021. And we found out in the fall of 2021 that the state was partnering with us to the tune of $28.5 million to launch this reimagined reentry program.
What are your thoughts on how, as a broader society, we can start to maybe view systems like the Norwegian system as something that we should adopt at scale in this country?
I mean, I think it starts with like having the conversation. It's about narrative change. I'm always very encouraged to share my story with people and like help them kind of break free from the paradigm or the stereotype of what someone who formerly incarcerated is. Because what currently and formerly incarcerated people are is people. We're people. And, it's hard for people to fail when you have other people around them cheering them on to succeed. So if we want to live in a society, I think it was Dostoevsky who said, if you want to see the condition of a nation, look to its prisons. Mm-hmm. Like, okay, look to our prisons. Like we're like leading the world in incarceration. Like, what is that saying about us as a community of people who are trying to figure things out? So yeah, it starts with narrative change, like understanding that these are people, regardless of poor choices, that we have an opportunity and a shared responsibility to restore. While the harm can't be undone from the past, we can prevent harm in the future by making the investment into people instead of punishment.
Yeah, if you want people to respond as humans, treat them like humans.
Yeah,
I think you mentioned something that you just kind of got me thinking. You mentioned the kind of the culture, right, at play here in this country. I'm just wondering, what is some very different about the society in Norway and in Scandinavia, and what led them, right, to their thinking and their approach, to how to treat incarceration as a form of rehabilitation, where we haven't really made that discovery. I know you mentioned, California's working on it. I know that I think Doug Burgum, when he was still the governor of North Dakota, was working on reforming, the North Dakota system based on the Norwegian model. But it seems just like you mentioned earlier, smart money, right? Like if we as a society took a step back and started asking the questions about, how we want to address this problem, this challenge, shouldn't problem, it's a challenge. How do we want to address this challenge for the benefit of all of society, not just those who are incarcerated? Because if we address it, everybody benefits. Everybody benefits. What do you think are some
Yeah,
of the challenges that are preventing that?
Oh, wow. I mean, that's a big question. And, so just to be clear, like I'm a transformationalist and like my life philosophy is all about personal responsibility. I believe that any change starts with me. At my best, I'm looking in the mirror at what I'm contributing to before I look out the window and say like, it's because of that this is happening. Right. And I'll add this. The history of Norway is a lot different than the history of the United States of America.
Sure.
So, like I said, I'm not an out the window kind of guy, but racism is real. Slavery was real. And there are forms of modern day slavery that still exist today. I believe that to be true.
I think that was kind of what I was leading into. If you look at Norway, right? Norway's pretty homogenous, and you look at the United States, right? I mean, we do have a lot of, institutionalized racism. And I think, when you look at the prison population, there's certainly something there at play, right? That is preventing us from kind of overcoming these systemic challenges.
Yeah, it's us. And when I say us, I mean people. It's just people. And, I would also throw in like the perceptions of power, like who has it, who's willing to share it. I don't need to say like the percentage of wealth in this world and who holds it. And, so things like that are all at play. And at the end of the day, I'm a big fan of Voltaire and Candide specifically, where like we could tend to our garden, have the conversations that we can have, exercise the influence that we have in the spheres that we have available to us.
You've lived both sides of this system. You've experienced a dehumanizing system and you've experienced redemption. What about the work that you're doing now, the leaders that you're talking with, and all the conversations that you're having, your perspective too, right? And their perspectives. What gives you hope that we can actually transform the justice system at scale?
I mean, that's a great question. And I'm encouraged. I'm encouraged on different levels. So we have some amazing partnerships that we've been able to cultivate, from executive leadership at huge tech companies like SAP, to the governor of California, to, the deputy director of the BOP that oversees 122 federal institutions. Like they all are like wanting to support this work. And when you have people, regardless of their politics, regardless of their religion, who can unify around a good thing, it's a good thing to support people in coming out to be good people. I mean, I'm encouraged by that. And, even though I like gave the nod to the other powers at play, I choose to believe that in the end, good will prevail.
So, Jason, I'd like to get your take, on, we have this thing we do. It's called the 4 forces. And we ask every guest, I'd love to get your take on the 4 forces at play that are driving change relative to the issues you care most about.
So the first thing for me, which actually really supported in our pitch to the state of California, is proximity. Proximity in leadership and lived experience as expertise. So there's a growing recognition. There was actually a study done by Stanford several years ago that basically found that people who are closest to the problem typically have the best insights to solutions to those very problems. There's institutions that are confronted with like limits of like top-down leadership. I remember being inside where like we would have people coming from all of these colleges, Ivy Leagues, like they're telling us what's wrong with us. And it's like, this is why you're broken. And this is what it takes to fix you. And it just wasn't landing. And I contrast that against the work we were able to do from a place of lived experience, our proximity. Like we had walked a mile in those shoes. It wasn't foreign to us to be in our stuff. And we could have conversations that were authentic and rooted in care and impactful for people that inspire transformation. So number one is proximity. Like people who are closest to the problem typically have the best insights into their solutions. The second force I would say is understanding that what I said earlier, like hurt people choose to hurt people. So being informed about people's trauma, because you can't get to a responsible mindset unless you allow a person to really unpack what I would call victim's mindset, or which comes from their trauma, which comes from the way in which they were raised, the experiences they had that helped shape their worldview, that contributed to their choice to make a crime. Like really giving people the space to unpack that. That's the only way to get to a mindset of like, I can see that. I see how I use those events to justify my activity. And now I'm ready to make new choices today to create different outcomes for my future. So understanding the importance of like people having the space and the support to unpack their trauma. The third one would be around the economy and inclusion. Before we started this like podcast, Dr. Sellers and I were talking about like some just challenges for people to get a job coming out of prison. There's thousands of barriers to employment in our country, tens of thousands for people with a criminal conviction. So like understanding that when someone's coming out of incarceration, and at least in California, they're still only provided with $200 gate money to get a bus pass and figure it out. And then they go and try and find a job, and they're confronted with like 27,000 different barriers to employment. Like that's a problem. So like as a force to change or to transform things, having the conversations with employers, incentivizing employers and industries to enact what I like to call fair chance hiring, where, you know, people have paid their debt to society. And if they're applying for a job in California, we've actually successfully passed a law called Ban the Box, where you can no longer like have the box to check if you have a criminal conviction. But that only goes so far, because like they don't have the box on the application anymore for a job. But then once you interview, then they can still do a background check, and they can still say, oh, you know, we think we're going to pass this time. So, you know, the employer partnerships for us at Crop are really critical. It's about like not looking for a charitable or a handout for people who complete our program, but saying like these people are the most qualified. They've learned lessons at rock bottom that a lot of people don't find at the mountaintop. We provide them with training. They're going to show up with a level of loyalty, resilience, and grit that's uncommon. And they just need an opportunity, a foot in the door. And so the more organizations that are having conversations with employers that are opening these doors, that's going to be something that's really going to change things, because then you'll have all the data showing individuals coming out of incarceration, contributing to companies at, you know, high performing. And it'll be like, okay, there's a new narrative here. This formerly incarcerated pipeline of talent is actually adding value to our society and our economy, versus taking it away with some of the narrative on, you know, recidivism. And the fourth thing, you know, it's one of the things we knew was that the scale of what we wanted to do was not feasible with like money from foundations, which you need that too, money from foundations or philanthropy. We knew that the government had to be involved. So policy is huge at the state level and the federal level. That is certainly an area where it's a top-down approach. You need people in positions of power when it comes to state and federal budgets to be able to make decisions, and empower organizations, corporations to really disrupt some of these barriers that are facing people coming out of incarceration from seizing opportunities and thriving.
You know, are you seeing some of those things change, at least in California, in terms of like reentry skills? You know, giving people the tools they need to be able to come back and engage in let's just call it, I mean, I hate the term normal society, but you know, society outside of those four walls of incarceration.
Well, I see it with our program, that's for sure. I mean, in California, there is still a very big gap, largely, between the steps that have been taken inside of institutions to incentivize rehabilitative programming, fund rehabilitation inside and the reentry framework when people get out. Like there's not much connection. So it's like you're in prison, you can get in this group and you can get a chrono here, you can get this certification for a career that on the streets is going to be like hard to make ends meet, right? But even though those things that they're doing, it's not connected to what's happening out in the community. When you parole, it's like, okay, so where do I go to get housing? Well, you can go down the street and you can talk to them. Where do I go to get employment? Okay, well, there's a place that hires formerly incarcerated over there. You can go talk to them. What do I do for, some mental health stuff? Well, go down the street, and see if they'll take you there. One thing you have to do is report to your parole officer or else you're going to get violated and go back to prison. But you have $200 to figure all this out. Forget all the rest, the super supportive services of like getting your driver's license, your birth certificate, all these things that, you've been separated from society. Where am I going to get this stuff from? Or who's going to help me get it? So out here in the community, like none of those people are communicating. And they're not communicating with each other, much less communicating with the institutions about like, what have they been doing inside and how can we like ease the transition out here to the supports that we're offering out here. So that's what we do. We work inside of prisons and then we connect people inside of prison to our program outside of prison. And we put it all in one tent, like as far as mindset, skill set, employment, housing, it's all right. And supportive services. It's all right here for you, but we're only so big. We can only do so much. We've served over 200 people in the last 2.5 years. And our wait list is 1,500. And there's like 95,000 people who are incarcerated in California. Like there's just no way we can serve everyone. So that's what's needed is a more seamless flow of communication of the changes that are happening inside that are creating like more opportunities for people to rehabilitate because they do exist in California to some degree with the resources that are out in the community. So there's a more seamless transition between the two.
Amazing.
I'd love to ask, how can our listeners help you? Like, is there something that the people that are listening to this podcast can do, to be a force for good to help, the crop organization?
Well, I mean, number one is like listening to this conversation. If they'd just be willing to entertain the possibility that like people are more than their worst choice. Right. And like that's a start. It's about societal transformative thinking about what's possible for people and like how I can contribute to it, even by just being in conversation with people. Like what's the smallest thing I could do to help shift the way we as a community are thinking about people who have made poor choices and have been locked away. Beyond that, I mean, they could always go to, croporganization.org. We are a nonprofit and, we have all of, the services we provide, the fellows that we are supporting in their transition back in. And, if they feel so inclined to contribute, that would be amazing as well.
I'm just going to cut out the date range, but I'll ask it pretty straight. So Jason, relative to the forces of change society is facing, what is the most important book that you could think of that people need to read and why?
When I was incarcerated, I read a lot of books. And the one that I think would benefit all society to pick up and peruse is called The Art of Possibility. The general premise of the book, it's a transformative book about relationships and the way in which we view other people. And there's several chapters in there that I believe invite us to be the best version of ourselves. One that really sticks out for me is there's a chapter called Giving Everyone an A. Giving Everyone an A. And the thrust of that chapter is about like when you meet someone or when you hear about someone, assume the best. Assume they're already at their best and hold them to that level. I think so often in our society, we have our stereotypes, our perspectives, our paradigms about generalized ideas, and we assume the worst. And I think that's killing us as a community. So yeah, The Art of Possibility was a really good book.
Thank you, Jason.
Fantastic. Well, so first, thank you so much for your time. I know you're super busy. We really appreciate you, taking the opportunity to join us on Forces of Change for this conversation. And I wish you the very best in your endeavors as you continue to travel this road, and a happy holiday season.
Thank you, Dr. Sellers and Annie. You as well.
Thank you, Jason.